small area, and if we extend the count to include some of the local government reserves in the Bankstown area, we're up to about 70 species. Our local native orchids and the means by which they pollinate is always an interesting topic. So tonight is my chance to share with you some of these species. I can't show them all because we'll be here a couple of hours. So in the next 30 minutes, you'll get a taste of some of the beauty that can be seen in our local bushland. And I'll touch briefly on some aspects of pollination. So whenever I wave this arrow, the cursor, I'm pointing to either a flower part or a particular species. So this guy here is Calochilus Bearded. It's a very small terrestrial orchid, probably only about 15 mils in height, and it occurs in some of the soak areas, some areas where there's a little bit of retained moisture. And this orchid species here is one of the lithophytic orchids. It grows on rocks only. It's Caudatus reflexa. So its common name is the dog orchid. The flowers have a slight scent of dog urine. I mean, I haven't got a strong sense of smell, but you can pick up there is that type of scent from those flowers. Okay, so I'm going to go through things mostly alphabetically. We'll start with one orchid genera called Acanthus. We have 4 known species, and all of the species have very similar looking leaves, and it's very difficult to tell what species you're looking at just based on the leaves. You need to see them in flower before you can really know which one you're dealing with. And they mostly have these heart-shaped single base leaf. The leaves often raise off the ground in more moister seasons and lift out of the leaf litter. So by far the most common orchid species of all within the Yeramba area is Acanthus fornicatus. So like many of the orchid species, they have multiple flowers occurring along flowering stems, and these orchids are tiny, as you can see from the small enlargement on the right. This particular species has the dorsal sepal in a very much a cap shape, which is quite a distinctive feature to, you know, the average bushwalker and I guess somewhat of a novice like myself. That's a distinctive feature, the cap across the top compared to the other 3 species. So sometimes the Acanthus and even the greenhood species won't actually grow terrestrially. They'll grow directly on sphagnum moss or their tubers. You can see on this picture on the right, the white tuber is the root of the orchid. They'll grow within sphagnum moss on rocks, but that can be somewhat of a risk, because if the winter season becomes very dry, or the season leading up to flowering becomes dry, often those plants will wither. The tubers will survive, but the plants will wither and they won't go to flower. Some of the best specimens we'll find are in the terrestrial orchids. So these tubers, or the parent tuber, grows leading up to the time the leaves emerge before flowering. The pterostylis have a rosette of leaves at the base. The Acanthus have a single leaf, and as the plant flower leading up to flowering, it'll produce some daughter tubers. So some extra tubers will branch off that. The parent tuber will die, and it will sometimes produce 2 or 3 daughter tubers, and that's how colonies of orchids form and expand. So Acanthus excertus is the flowers are a little bit larger than Acanthus bacillus. They're spaced more apart. The flowering stem is longer. Acanthus bacillus tends to be more green, and they've both got very narrow dorsal sepals. I've included some of the common names for people who have trouble remembering the botanical names, but as most of you would know, common names are not always accurate. A mosquito orchid in New South Wales compared to one in Queensland might be 2 completely different species. The Acanthus excertus is more common in the reserves. We do only have the 1 plant that we know of at Yeramba, but yeah, it's still one on our species list. Acanthus caudatus, the Mayflower orchid. the percentage of, or the proportion of the sepals in terms of the dimension of the entire flower is huge. We only have a couple of small patches of Acanthus caudatus, or a couple of known patches. So it's not very common at all at Yeramba. The caladinas, this one pictured on the right is a very small caladinia. It's only about maybe 12 to 15 mils tall. The fairy orchid, it's very beautiful small plant. Some of the larger ones, these get to about 3 to 4 centimeters tall. Caladinia picta flowers in autumn, Caladinia catenata in spring. So they're giants compared to elata. Picta always has a red column, whereas catenata has a green column. And generally speaking, the sepals and petals of picta are more pinker tones. You do get pink catenata that can coexist with whites, but they'll always have the green column. And sometimes you'll get a slight difference in the arrangement and the shapes of these little fingers, or calli between the species. That can be distinctive, but I won't go into that because I'll be getting out of my depth. Another couple of caladinias, Caladinia carnea, which is almost all the time a pink flower, strongly pink, and Caladinia fuscata. Caladinia fuscata is generally a little bit smaller than carnea. It's larger than elata, and the distinctive feature is the lateral lobes of the labellum always curve inwards, whereas you can see on carnea they're pointing straight upwards. If we had a side-on photo of fuscata, these lateral lobes would always also be pointing forward towards the tip of the labellum. So they're the known caladinias. I think Cyanicula cerulea used to be a caladinia, and I'm not too sure if they've switched it back. So forgive me if the names I'm using aren't exactly current with what the New South Wales Herbarium has advised, but I can't keep up with the name changes. So anyway, this is Cyanicula cerulea. I've only seen it growing as a solitary plant, whenever I've seen it in various locations, but when you see it, it's very special. We've got flying ducks. There's 3 colonies of flying ducks at Yeramba, and this particular colony where this photo was taken has a colour variation to the other 2 and has much deeper brown and orange in that entire colony. The flowers are held on the flowering stems upside down, so this labellum, or the head of the duck, flips into the cavity of the belly when the insect lands, and that holds the insect captive for a short period to ensure pollination. I'll get more into that later. Calochilus, the bearded orchids, we have 4 species. In this photo, you've got Calochilus paludosus. That would be our most common beard orchid. And you've also got, this is again an enlargement of the red beard orchid, Calochilus paludosus. You've got Robertsonii, the purple beard orchid, and probably our rarest bearded orchid is Gracillus. It occurs at one of the bushland headlands further east of Yeramba, but I think we've found another plant last year, and I hope to get some better photos of it at Picnic Point as well. So, but it's occurs, well, these 2 on the left flower in spring, but the one, the late beard orchid, flowers in December, and it's a much smaller flower, a more slender stem. Probably the most interesting one of the 4 is Calochilus campestris, the copper beard orchid. It's certainly my favourite orchid of all the orchid species, and it's striking to look at. The height of the flowers is around about 3 to 4 centimetres, but they do come in a variety of colours, as you can see on these slides on the right. So there are colour variations with most of the orchid species, and a lot of them do flower in multiples on long stems. It's in the best interests of any orchid not to open all their flowers at the same time. So they'll in most cases, or in all cases, as far as I'm aware, the first flowers will open from the base down here. So these are pollinated flowers, and then you'll rarely see any more than 3 or 4 flowers open at any one time, and the last flowers to be open will be up the top. If they all opened at once, it means the pollination period, or the opportunity for pollination, would probably only last 2 or 3 days, whereas if they take turns in opening, the pollination period is 2 or 3 weeks, or sometimes longer, and it gives the chance a much better chance of reproduction. One of the lithophytic species, Dendrobium linguiforme, it's very common. I'm sure many of you have seen it. Unfortunately, some samples are poached from the bush. I mean, luckily it's common, but it's still forbidden to take native plants from the bush without some sort of permit. This is probably one of the more special specimens we have at Yeramba. And we've got a climbing orchid at Yeramba, common name bootlace orchid, and it's well, ours at Yeramba are doing more scrambling than climbing, but we were lucky enough to bump into a couple from Mickey's Point recently that know their local plants and have found some really nice specimens that are getting 3 to 4 meters off the ground and actually climbing trees. So we look forward to getting some nice photos of those next year. It's sarcophytic, which means it exists in association with leaf litter and wood debris. It has no leaves, so it actually feeds off decomposing wood. Now, with small orchids, and microtus are very, very small flowers, they're probably the smallest orchid flowers we have, also come small insects. So this is some sort of midge or gnat, and this is one of our onion orchids, Microtus rara, at on the ridge orchid at Blackwall. Helmet orchids, we've got, I wouldn't say Corybas fimbriatus is very common, but that occurs at Yeramba. Stays very low to the ground, as you can probably tell. Single leaf, not quite as pointed as an Acanthus leaf, tends to be more round. And this one has its labellum fully exposed to potential pollinator, whereas Corybas aconitaflorus, which is our most common helmet orchid, the reproductive parts of the flower are hidden underneath, so the insect would have to crawl inside to pollinate. So you'd be guessing there'd be some sort of scent to attract the insect to pollinate. Corybas pruinosus, we have a little patch at Yeramba that was found earlier this year. There were reports and historical records of it actually occurring or being found in the 80s by another knowledgeable bushwalker, but we've never, well, I've not been able to find those particular plants in that location, but it's good that we have a third helmet orchid in a confirmed location now at Yeramba. The Cryptostylus, 2 species, quite large flowers compared to a lot of the other orchids. This is Cryptostylus erecta, bonnet orchid. So this is a sort of a cavity in the shape of a bonnet. Beautiful colours, particularly depending on the direction the sun's coming. Sometimes the best time to get photographs of some of these orchids is when the sun is very low in the sky. You get to know your plants, you get to know which way they're facing. You need to know whether you get there in morning or late afternoon to get the best photographs. And the timing's got to be right too. So this orchid species on the right, Stylus subulata, the cow orchid. You can see the flowers are in the shape of a cow's head. Got quite a number of these plants in one location at Picking Point. Came across these 2 or 3 years ago. The hyacinth orchids. Only 3 known species. Pictured here is roseum. You can notice with the roseum, the labellum, the fine hairs are close to a white colour, and that's one of the features you look for with roseum versus punctatum. So you can see in this slide Both Dipodium punctatum and Roseum do look similar. Dipodium variegatum, which flowers a little bit later. These two on the left, or the one on the left and the one in the middle, punctatum roseum, will be flowering quite soon in the next 3 or 4 weeks. Variegatum flowers a little bit later, but it's distinctly different. Not only is the flowering stem got variegations and spots, the peduncle which connects the stem to each flower has the spots, whereas in these two species that is lacking. So if we take a closer look at punctatum and roseum, roseum is not, we don't have too many plants. It's probably our least common hyacinth orchid. But the sepals are just strongly recurved backwards, or at least from what's been explained to me, the distinctive features for roseum, apart from these white hairs on the labellum, the sepals have a really strong curve backwards, whereas in punctatum, the sepals curve back only slightly. And the hairs on the labellum of punctatum are more of a mauve or a pink colour. The blotches on roseum are more smaller and they don't tend to merge, but on Dipodium punctatum, which is commonly known as the blotched orchid, these blotches are much larger and they tend to join up. So when the flowers are pollinated, they form these pods. These pods are like a football shape. They dry out and then they start to split open. And like many orchid species that form these ovoid-shaped pods, they contain maybe around 500 seeds, and as they split open and start to dry out, a gentle breeze comes along and blows the seeds some distance from the parent plant. The Diurus species, in August we first get Diurus maculata flowering. Its common name, leopard orchid. They seem to like to give a lot of the orchid common names after animals. So here we've got Diurus aurea. There's usually at least a 2-week break between the finishing of flowering of maculata before aurea starts, which is good in a way because it means they're not competing for pollinators. You can see the longer ears on aurea, a bit like a donkey's ears. And we do have one plant that I've found at Yeramba. This is the tiger orchid, Diurus sulphurea, a lot more common in the local government reserves. The waxlip orchids, Glossodia species, Glossodia major on the left, and Glossodia minor. Obviously, major has larger flowers. Glossodia minor, if you look carefully at the reproductive parts in the centre of the flower, there are some differences there. Glossodia minor can be pink or purple, but these are mostly blue. Glossodia minor is a lot more common. So when we look at Glossodia major and look at the reproductive structure of the flower, this is the labellum. So if an insect lands here, this long heart-shaped will flip upwards into the face here, or into the column. So this has got a common name, parson, in the pulpit. So you can see that it looks a bit like a parson, I guess. The leaves of major are also comparatively longer. They're and this is a photo here left of Glossodia minor, smaller leaf. Glossodia minor has 2 little black calli, a bit like child's boots, young child's boots, and this labellum flips up and closes it up when the insect lands. A couple of weird looking ones, Lyporanthus suaveolens on the left and Orthoceras strictum on the right. Lyporanthus suaveolens, we have a lot of plants at Yeramba, but if you might see 200 or 300 plants or recognise their leaves, but you might find only half a dozen of them flower. So it's one thing when you're bushwalking to recognise the leaves and know the location and then return when they are flowering at that time, but it's another thing to actually see them in flower. You can't guarantee that every plant's going to flower. Orthoceras strictum hasn't yet flowered. It's one of the last flowering orchids of the year. That will be flowering probably late October, early November, and they tend to occur on laterite soils. We have some leek orchids. As you can see from the photo on the right, they get to 1 metre or so tall. Again, the flowers open from the base, and the last flowers to open are at the top of the flowering stem. These flowers are held upside down on the stem, so this is actually the dorsal sepal. This frilly part here is the labellum, pointing upwards. And I've only seen Prasophyllum elatum. There have been reports of Prasophyllum patens, the sandstone leek orchid, but I've yet to find that, and I'm keeping an eye on some plants at the moment that may end up being different. So with Yeramba itself, in terms of diversity in greenhood species, we know of up to 10 different Pterostylus or greenhood species. It's just got a bit of a change in topography, I guess, where there's a little bit more filtered light compared to the open heathlands up the top of Picnic Point, and that creates, I guess, more ideal conditions for some greenhoods to grow in some of those areas and other orchid species. So I've listed the species that we know exist at Yeramba. There might be one or two missing that are on historical records, but I'm yet to see them, so I've only listed those 10. So the first to flower every year is Pterostylus acuminata. So if we look at the next slide, with Pterostylus acuminata, this very fine structure here is the labellum, and that's what the insect will get attracted to. If you're photographing greenhoods, you have to be careful not to bump the flower, not to disturb sticks that are near the flower, because if you disturb the flower, this labellum here will disappear. It will close and retract back into the head of the greenhood. And one of the most important identification features of a greenhood, particularly with some species that look quite similar, is to get a photo of the labellum. So that's important. I mean, it takes about 15 minutes for the labellum to reset, but a lot of us won't have that time to wait. So my favourite greenhood is definitely Pterostylus nutans, nodding greenhood, more common along the ridge walk and in more shaded areas. We do have some down on the western side of Yeramba and common in the local reserves. So just on nutans, if I stop for a moment and just briefly explain the structure of an orchid flower, I know nutans flower is pointing downwards, but firstly we have this translucent sepal called the dorsal sepal, which often has green, brown or red spots, stripes, I should say. In this case, the lateral petals are exactly the same length and occur just inside the dorsal sepal. So there's two lateral petals, and combined they form the galea. The galea is the hood that protects the reproductive structure of the flower. And you've got some lateral sepals here that are often pointed. In the different greenhood species, those sometimes the length of the sepals or the direction they point helps with identifying what type of Pterostylus species you're dealing with. And lastly, internally inside, you've got the a very highly modified petal known as the labellum, and this is where the insect will sort of crawl towards before the pollination process can start. So if we, a lot of the orchids are pollinated by mosquitoes or gnats or midges, and the gnat will pick up like a pheromone. It'll pick up a scent that we can't smell, but it might pick it up downwind, and it will be attracted. It'll land on the galea somewhere. It'll crawl its way down to the labellum, and it'll eventually reach a tipping point or a balance point where the flower will close within a fraction of a second its labellum, and it doesn't pin the insect down. It basically just traps it inside in a little chamber. And the only way the insect for that 10 or 15 minute period can get out is to do a commando crawl through a very narrow opening past the labellum to get out. And to do that, it would have to brush its thorax against the pollinia inside the flower. And if it's been to another flower already, it will transfer pollen from that previous flower to pollinate this flower, or if not, it will take pollen away from this flower before it moves on to the next. Pollinated flowers, this is what a Pterostylus Newton's seed pod looks like. And you know, within 3 to 4 months, the pod dries out and the seed is released, and hopefully will spread to form new plants. Pterostylus grandiflora is a really interesting greenhood. It's quite impressive. It's got a very fine labellum. And I just want to show you a very brief video. You'll have to look carefully in this area in the center of the flower where I'm pointing. I'm not too sure what such a fine labellum would actually trap, but anyway, I'll play the video. It's in slow-mo. You can watch with some gentle manipulation the labellum flip back and retract into the actual galea, and that's normally triggered by an insect. So I'll just play it again. That's the labellum there, and you can see how the labellums of different orchid species, how quickly they move. That would happen in less than half a second. Okay, next slide. Pterostylus longiflora is what, or the tall green hood, has multiple flowers on the stems, and the stems are much taller than some other green hood species. You can see the labellum is well exposed. Again, if the insect lands on this labellum, it will flip up into the cavity and hold it there to encourage pollination. By far our most common green hood is Pterostylus consina. The trim green hood, it occurs in large colonies. The flowers are very small compared to other green hoods, and they usually have like a little forked tongue there. Pterostylus saxicola is, we don't have too many plants. We do have some at Yeramba, but unfortunately it's an endangered species. Its distribution extends down towards Camden. I think there are small populations at Freeman's Reach in the northwest of Sydney, not that I've seen those. It's got an interesting labellum that has whiskers on it. I'm not too sure of the purpose of those whiskers, but yeah, it's a beautiful plant, and unfortunately there's not too many of them left. Okay, we're getting close to the end now. These are the sun orchids. The sun orchids, as you'd expect by the common name, only open at the height of the day when the sun's right out. So you really only see the flowers open between 11 AM and say 2 PM. So you've got to pick your days. When they're not open, this is a shot in the morning, they are still very beautiful when the flowers are sort of partly closed. You can see the beautiful colours of this species, Telemitra ixioides. So with Telemitra ixioides, its common name is the spotted sun orchid. You can see the spots in this picture. Most of the time it will have spots. On occasions it won't have spots. Quite a large flower, about 3 or probably 4 centimetres, maybe even 5 centimetres across, compared to some of the other smaller sun orchids. And occasionally you'll see pink forms, and very rarely you'll see white Telemitra ixioides. So there are a few other sun orchids. All of these are much smaller, like they're a third of the size, maybe no more than half the size of ixioides. And some of these are quite frustrating or difficult to photograph, because unless you get a day that's 25 degrees plus, you're not going to see the flowers open. And you've got to get your best photograph, because I only use an iPhone 7, I don't use any flash photography. To get your best photos, you want the flowers facing the sun, you want them fully open to get as good a shot as you can. So they might only flower for 2 weeks, 3 weeks tops, and if you get 1 or 2 days that are warm enough in spring that exceed temperatures enough to ensure that the flowers open, you got to get your photos then. Otherwise, some of these flowers don't even have to open. Some of them can stay closed and not get pollinated for an entire season by one insect. So they have crumbling pollen, so they can self-pollinate without the flower opening. And again, they form seed pods. And there are other sun orchid species. I actually haven't seen them yet, but there are other couple of others like Purpurea, and I think pedunculata around Yeramba. So, we've got Cymbidum suave, grows on trees, so it's epiphytic, and unfortunately there aren't too many of them left around. They get poached, and a problem with the Cymbidum is that we sometimes see these dendrobium beetles. Those of you who have orchids in your garden might sometimes get visits from these dendrobium beetles. Very hungry creatures. They produce larvae, which are also hungry, that eat the leaves. So they chew on the flowers. They'll even chew on the seed pods, and they're quite destructive. So they often do an escape act when you try to catch them by dropping straight to the ground. And the best way to catch them, if you do want to get rid of them so they don't destroy your plant, is to put one cupped hand underneath the insect, and then with the other hand go in to scare the, so it drops straight into your other hand. Because if it drops to the ground, it'll just disappear, and you'll have trouble finding it if you do want to dispose of those beetles. So here, this is the final slide. This is just a photo of one of the tracks at Yeramba, typical area where a lot of the hyacinth orchids flower, and many other species, of course. Just some final slides to finish up. You see some pretty funny, weird things when you're out on walks. You see orchids doing funny poses. This one's doing a bit of a curtsy. This is Calochilus Bearded. This one's giving us a salute, and this one's patting his mate on the back for getting pollinated and doing such a good job. So that's Calochilus Bearded as well. So that's the end of the slideshow. So I'll get out of that, or we'll go to that one and just downsize that. Okay, so I'll leave my mic on if you like. Okay. I hope you heard all that and I wasn't talking for 30 minutes.
Thank you so much, Karlo. That was absolutely awesome. I'm definitely giving you a round of applause. The photos were amazing. So my first question to you, I think you said that you took them all on an iPhone 7. Yeah. Is that correct? All those photos?
Yeah, I find that model very good for macro. Mm-hmm. And I don't like bulky cameras. They restrict my movement.
Yeah.
Yeah, I like something that can slip into my pocket. And with the smartphones, the technology is so good at the moment. We can see things that you can't see with the naked eye. And you get to know your camera. You get to, know how to use natural light, and try and present the best features of the flower to others. And obviously, we're so blessed at Picnic Point with hundreds of species. They're in great numbers. You get to see some really nice specimens. So I'm showing you photos of the best specimens.
Yeah, no, that's fantastic. Yeah, so if anyone else has got any questions for Karlo, what you're probably the best thing to do is just to unmute yourself by clicking on the microphone icon at the top right-hand corner of your screen. And yeah, so you can just ask away.
Hello, can you hear me?
I can hear. Is that
Ian?
Hi, Ian. How are you?
You can hear me, Karlo?
I can hear you, but Colin's going to help me if I don't know the answer. So you go.
Thank you so much. That was wonderful, Karlo. Congratulations on your knowledge and your ability to put that together. Can I ask you whether you've got any information for us about the trends of protection and sustainability of those orchids? Are they safe? Are they secure, or are they in reduction?
I don't think they're in reduction. We've had 2 very good seasons in the last 2 years of rainfall. When the orchids do finish flowering and the leaves wither and shrivel away, the tubers are always quite safe under the ground. Unless there's excavation going on, the tubers can survive for years before they flower next, and the plants are usually always there. for future. We do know of a lot of rare orchid species, and we're pretty privy as to where the locations are. So we are protective of the plants. Obviously, some recent bike, jump, and excavation movement can disturb some of the orchid species, and we know where the rare sport orchid species are. Many of you would know the orchids occur along a lot of the walking tracks where they get a little sunlight getting in, a little bit of water runoff. So unfortunately, some orchids, as they occur on the edges of tracks, can be under threat from bike riders or people jogging. But generally, all of the orchid species at Yeramba are safe in the numbers they are. We'd like to see them multiply, but if anything, they're increasing in number. To answer your question.
So long as the bush generally is untouched or safe, the orchids will survive.
Yeah, pretty much. Yeah, in the vast majority of cases. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, Karlo, thank you so much. Your presentation should be preserved by the Australian Museum. Do you intend to send it to them?
No, not really, because all of the information I've given you is basically information that's been shared with me by other people. So I'm just passing on the knowledge I've gained from others. I think it's a very small group, and I've done this presentation before. Like I said, I love all native flora, so it's easy to do a presentation like this on any plant family, but orchids would have to be the most interesting across those groups. So.
Well, that's very modest of you, Karlo, but I do suggest that the Australian Museum would be very interested in having your recording. And thank you. I've enjoyed it so much. Thank you.
Thanks, Ian. Okay. Just out of interest, how many people have been viewing tonight, roughly? I know that a couple of people had trouble logging on, but
we have 14 people, Karlo.
Okay. All right.
Yeah. I might ask a really basic question, just in case anyone's wondering and they're worried to ask it. Where is Yeramba Lagoon?
Well, if people know Henry Lawson Drive, it's basically at the bottom of the two hills. So it's an area of water, tidal water, that has been closed off for many years. You probably know the Osgrid power station. It's to the west of that, and it's to the east of Sylvan Grove Native Gardens. So it's at Picnic Point. It's just north of the Georges River at Picnic Point. But some of the locals referred to Yeramba as the whole area, not just the around the lagoon itself, but right up in the heathland on top of Picnic Point Ridge, the Ridge Walk itself on the southern side of Henry Lawson Drive, and Blackwall, which is below that. So it's a really special area, considering it's relatively small compared to the entire landmass of the national park. It probably holds about 90% of the orchid species across the entire national park, both north and south of the river.
Yeah, that's really interesting. Yeah, the presentation blew me away. Like, I've been walking down there, visiting there all my life, and I was astounded at the number of plants that I still have not seen. And it just goes to show you how much biodiversity is hidden right on our doorstep, and right within the confines of a massive global city such as Sydney, and why it's just so crucial to preserve all these last remaining remnants that have survived the development process to date.
Yeah.
So has anyone else got any questions for Karlo? Just unmute yourself and speak up, and Karlo would be happy to answer them.
Just wanted to make the comment too that there's probably still species that haven't yet been found at Yeramba. We're finding new species all the time. Not new species as in new species, but new species for our area. You know, so the list is growing, and you have to have a keen eye and you have to look carefully because a lot of these orchids are small, and people just need to be more observative and more curious. So if they do see something, they should photograph it, and if they don't know what it is, there's people out there that will be able to tell you, and you just don't know whether you'll come across something that's rare or common one day. So it's important that people try and keep a photographic log and a record of what they see. And you know, we all learn from each other, but there's a lot more undiscovered stuff out there, not just orchids.
Okay, so if there's anyone else would like to make any commentary or ask anything else, yeah, you're welcome to do so now. Otherwise, we'll wrap up the proceedings. Yeah, so I will, yeah, thank everyone for their attendance tonight, and particularly Karlo for sharing such an informative talk with us all, and those fantastic photos, and inspiring me to go out and look more closely at my local reserves. So yeah, it's really good. I'm sending you some virtual applause there, and yeah, if anyone else is interested in that isn't already a member of Bankstown Bushland Society, please consider joining us. It's only really through the power of people that we get to preserve these areas, and it's why the Georges River National Park was formed in the first place. So never forget that. So thank you very much, everyone, for your attendance, and thank you, Karlo.
Okay.
And we'll see you all again soon.
Thank you.
Thank you, Karlo. Thank you, Chris.
Thanks, Scott. Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Bye.
You still there?
I'm here.
Yeah.
Well done, Karlo. That was really good, mate.
Yeah, it was great to see them close up like that and have all the bits explained.
Yeah. How did it feel for you, Karlo? It was a bit hard to do it with the barrier of the on the Teams meeting, as opposed to doing it in person, I imagine.
Oops.
Are you there, Karlo? Karlo gone, or is he still there? I'm going to stop recording, actually.